Awesome. Thank you, Grace. All right, so welcome again, everyone. This is the first panel of the Young Researchers Forum, and the topic of this panel is masculinity and violence against women. I'm glad to welcome our speakers, Dr. Andrew Gibbs, Aneel Brar, and Siddhant Pasricha. My name is Devika, and I'll be moderating this panel. So how we'll go about this session today is that each speaker will make their opening remarks so we can understand their work in its context. After that, we'll go into a moderated Q&A section, and then the speakers will answer questions that are coming in from you guys as the audience. If you are tweeting about our event and this session, please use the hashtag SangatYRF. We're also running a live Jamboard where you can interact with us and other attendees. The link will be posted in the chat. I'll begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Andrew Gibbs. Dr. Andrew Gibbs is at the Gender and Health Research Unit at the South African Medical Research Council. His work has focused on men, primarily in urban informal settlements in South Africa, to understand how their social contexts and experiences shape behavior, including their poor mental health and the use of violence. Andrew, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Devika, and thanks for everyone for joining and for listening to me. So as said, I'm based out in South Africa at the Medical Research Council, and I think for the last 10 to 15 years, I've been really kind of looking and working focused on young people in informal settlements, so in some very challenging contexts. In terms of my kind of academic training, I'm a social psychologist by training, so I'm really interested to think about how these kind of broad social and structural factors impact on individuals and groups to shape their identities and health behaviors, and how individuals and groups internalize, resist, and try and transform them and navigate around them. So it's within that context I start to think about kind of men's uses of violence. And for that reason, as I start to talk, what I first want to do is try and describe some of these contexts to you, the kind of issues that young men have been facing as they've grown up. And I guess in many ways it resonates with what many of you might know from kind of work around slums. We just call them informal settlements. And obviously, you know, in South Africa, we've got a very long history of apartheid. Only 20-25 years of democracy, and these legacies are really crucial for shaping these kind of questions. But to give you a sense of these kind of challenges and the kind of context we're working in to kind of develop interventions for these young men. Okay, so we've got from Stats South Africa, we've got about 75% of young people are unemployed, whether or not they completed university. You know, where you've got 3/4 of your age cohort unemployed, opportunities for kind of developing a life, developing an identity are severely constrained. You know, from our own data, it's a bit old now, from 2016, only a third of young men had actually completed high school. So in the population we work with, 2/3 haven't completed high school. And this high school certificate is a kind of prerequisite for getting most jobs available in South Africa. As Devika's just mentioned, I'll talk quite explicitly about some of the experiences that some of the young people have experienced around sexual violence and emotional and physical violence. Just as a warning to people, that I'm about to dive into that. So in terms of abuse growing up, and we recognise that the drivers of abuse, the experiences young men faced as they were growing up, are obviously driven by their own parents' experiences of abuse and trauma and violence and poverty. But we're working in a context where only 11% of the young men report no experience of childhood abuse. So whether that's social, kind of emotional neglect, physical or sexual abuse. So very few of them kind of grew up in the first 18 years of their life in kind of contexts where they weren't experiencing challenges themselves. And this continues into adulthood. You know, 1/3 of them reported feeling close to death in their adulthood. You know, 40% reported being robbed at knife or gunpoint. I guess in these very challenging circumstances of poverty, of community violence, of experiencing interpersonal violence themselves, these young men start to build a sense of identity, life, and health behaviors as well. And I think we can't think about their high uses of substances, alcohol, and drugs, their poor mental health. About 45% of them report depression, without thinking about these contexts of violence, abuse, and that they've grown up in. Not to say that this kind of explains it all away or to justify it, but to help it understand the kind of issues that we're working around. And so then it comes to kind of violence in young men's lives and men's perpetration. So over half of the young men we work with report perpetrating intimate partner violence in the past year, and a third of them non-partner sexual violence. So these are young men in very kind of challenging circumstances who not only are experiencing violence themselves, but also perpetrating violence against women and girls. So in this context, we work very closely with the local NGO called Project Empower on developing interventions to address these kind of multiple health issues, often with men, but also with women, and increasingly now with couples to think about that. And I guess our interventions are based on the assumption that young people need to start to understand their lived realities, the underlying causes of what's happening to them, if they're going to start to change their own behaviors. So our focus is really experiential learning, kind of group-based learning, often shaped by Paulo Freire's kind of ideas of critical consciousness. And within this, there's a strong aspect of addressing gender equality or inequality within these programs, getting young men to think about power and how it relates both in their own lives, but also in their lives of people they love, like their partners. So the main project I've been working on has been one called Stepping Stones in Creating Futures, which is linked to relatively well-known gender transformative intervention called Stepping Stones to a Livelihoods intervention, recognizing that violence, men's perpetration of violence, needs to address both these aspects, both these kind of drivers. It's a very intensive intervention, relying highly on the skill and nature of young kind of men, like the people we're working with, to facilitate, to get people to think critically. And we did a large trial of this, where after 24 months, we did see men's perpetration of violence reduced significantly over that time, and their livelihoods also improved. And I guess I just wanted to finish by kind of touching on what we think are the mechanisms of change in that intervention. I guess central to that has been this questioning of gender norms. And obviously we can't address violence against women without addressing gender norms, because that's kind of writ large in all of their experiences. But I think the other stuff which was really important was around mental health and addressing what we've started to think of how men think they're stuck, a stuckness in their lives, that they can't figure out a way of moving forward and navigating their lives. And a lot of this has been to get men to reflect and share with each other, to build relationships and share these experiences, and start to realize that the challenges they face are not individual issues, but at broader levels. So often people will start saying, I hadn't realized, I thought this was just me, and want to kind of go back and revisit issues and start to build up this idea that the challenges they have aren't these individual ones, but ones collective to kind of their shared experience. And in doing that, they start to build ways of coping, reduce the shame in their lives, reduce the stress and anxiety, which when combined with questioning kind of the use of violence and the use in their relationships and gender norms, starts to get them to think about different ways of being. This work we do, while it does have these positive benefits, obviously, this is within a massive structural context, which we're not significantly transforming. We're rather getting young men to think about ways to work around, to navigate, to resist it in little ways, which, while limited, is very important at the individual level to them, because they have better lives, it's better to their partners, it's they're less violent towards their partners, and maybe at some level it will be good for the wider society, as slowly they'll start to feel the form of transformation. But I'll leave it there. Hand over
Thanks,
to
Thanks, Andy. Um, it's very interesting. I think we hear about the South African context in the context of violence fairly often, but it's nice to hear about the work that you're doing. So we'll come back to you with more questions. There's already a question for you that I'll ask later. We'll go to our next speaker, Aneel. Aneel Brar is the co-founder and executive director of the Mata Jaikaur Maternal and Child Health Center. He has led the development of a task-shared, non-specialist delivered perinatal mental health intervention called the Khushi Mamta program, also known as the Happy Motherhood program. He's also led a male-focused gender-based violence prevention program called the Men Against Violence program. He's a PhD candidate in medical anthropology at the University of Oxford and has a Master of Medical Sciences degree in global health delivery from Howard University. Aneel is also a long-time collaborator and friend. Over to you, Aneel.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Andrew's presentation actually was sparking a lot of things. So first of all, I'll say thank you for having me here. As Devika mentioned, it's been a sort of long-running collaboration with Sangat that I'm very happy with, and I'm always happy to be involved in these kinds of dissemination and learning activities, and honored to be here. So a little bit about me. So as Devika mentioned, I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Mata Jaikaur Maternal and Child Health Center. And even though now I'm training as a researcher, I still consider myself first an implementer. And so all of our lessons are derived from the implementation of our work. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today. And I just want to give you a bit of context, because context is obviously very important. So we operate in a district called, some of you might be familiar with it, but probably most won't, a district called Shri Ganganagar in Rajasthan, which is in northern India. And our district is at the very northern tip of the state of Rajasthan. On one side, it borders Punjab and Haryana to the east, and to the north and to the west is Pakistan. And I mention this because, of course, these sort of cultural factors for Northern South Asia are very important in terms of shaping patriarchy and the experience of violence, and also the experience of men. So our work started 10 years ago, and the objective back then was pretty simple. It was to create a rural clinic to provide essential healthcare for pregnant mothers who are vulnerable and kind of remote. And that was the objective. And so we created a clinic, we got clinicians involved, and our objective was to target vulnerable women. But what I think became clear is that a lot of the vulnerabilities you couldn't really address by simply just providing clinical care. We had to get out and address some of the social factors that create vulnerability. So with that in mind, this is when our collaboration with Sangat started, and I, along with some colleagues, went to the Leadership in Mental Health course, and we kind of started working on what Devika mentioned, which was the Khushi Mamta program, which is essentially an adapted version of the Thinking Healthy program for our area. And for those who don't know, the Thinking Healthy program is depression intervention for pregnant mothers in the perinatal period, so pregnant and new mothers, delivered a depression program delivered by lay counselors, so women recruited from the community to screen for depression and provide care. And this changed our intervention in a significant way, in that it allowed us to go from the clinic, even though this was a rural clinic, and go to villages and go house to house and go door to door and talk to families. And the program went pretty well. We screened about 1,200 women in 70 villages, and we enrolled about 160 women in our counseling programs. And we saw important changes. But what I want to talk about today are some of the lessons that we learned from our counselors and from our patients that pointed us into the direction of trying to address violence. So the biggest lesson, which sounds pretty obvious, but was surprising nonetheless, even though I've worked in this context for, at that time, 7 years, was just the amount and the ubiquity of violence that is experienced in the household. It really became apparent. And with that in mind, the model of the thinking healthy approach, which uses lay counselors to provide care that, even though it's meant to be directed towards families, it's really directed towards the mother herself. It really highlighted the insufficiency of that focus. And kind of like what Dr. Gibbs mentioned, we realized that this program is pretty insufficient unless we also address the mental health of husbands. And we actually just kind of mobilize men for this kind of work. So with this in mind, we started an exploratory project to do some formative research on how to actually do this. And this work was done a year and a half ago now. And some of the preliminary lessons that we've learned and that I'm happy to talk more about today with you all and learn a little bit more from you as well. Some of the things that we learned was that, number one, it's important to address the mental health of men. Two, there's an important opportunity to mobilize young and older men into this process. So one of the original ideas that we had when we thought about involving men in perinatal depression programming and reducing violence was the role that potential older men in the community could have. So men with increased social capital, men who've perhaps themselves gone through a process of change. So former perpetrators of violence, or men who have suffered from substance abuse and have overcome it, and who could provide that sort of guidance to younger men. But also using sort of younger men from the community as mental health counselors, just like we would use women to be counselors for perinatal women. So those were kind of two ideas. And the other really important lesson for our context was recognizing the importance of the institution of marriage, especially in South Asia, especially in Northern South Asia, in Northern India, as a platform for violence. So we can talk a little bit more about this, but marriage rates are extremely high in India compared to other countries. And when we look at things like suicide, which is now the #1 killer of women in that marriageable age, marriage is actually a risk factor for suicide. Whereas in most other countries, marriage is a protective factor against suicide. So that stat in itself doesn't tell you a lot, except for that there's something about this institution that I think can be changed and addressed. And so we're thinking about ways of actually looking at this, because the other side of it is that marriage is also the platform through which there's social support, through which there is access to healthcare, through all kinds of positive things as well. So we want to be able to not necessarily change norms, because that's a pretty difficult thing to do, but to harness sort of the positive aspects of existing norms. So that's kind of a broad thing. I'm happy to talk more about this in detail, but I'll leave it there with the context, and I'll turn it over back to you, Devika.
Thanks, Aneel. So we'll go on to our next speaker. Siddhant works as an associate with the Mardon Wali Baat program at the YP Foundation. Previously, Siddhant has worked towards imparting comprehensive sexuality education among young men and boys in various parts of New Delhi. Siddhant has also conducted research to understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organizations working with men and boys. They have a master's degree in labor studies and social protection from TISS and a bachelor's degree in social sciences and humanities from Ambedkar University, Delhi. They're interested in working on the intersections of masculinities, economy, and power. Over to you, Siddhant.
Thank you, Devika. Also, really excited to speak here because I'm sure I'll get to learn a lot about masculinities and violence from Aneel and Andrew. So thank you about that. I'll start by talking about what our organization does, and then what our program attempts to do. So talking about the organization, I'm from the YP Foundation. The YP Foundation operates from Delhi, and it's a feminist rights-based organization that believes in like youth leadership. So like that's why a lot of our work is with young people. We work on the issues of gender justice, health equity, sexuality rights by providing young people with the opportunity to learn, develop their capacities, and to take their own decisions. And while we are doing all of this, our attempt is to like be as intersectional as possible and to also have a pleasure-based approach. So that's what our organization does. Talking about the program, I am from the Mardwali Baat program. The entire program works towards enabling young men in campus spaces and community spaces to reflect on masculinities and like to also reflect on their experiences to reject the patriarchal gender norms. Our focus is on understanding how masculinities is intersectional and breaking away from the entire binary of man and woman. Prior to this, Mardwali Baat conducted a research called Mardwali Bate. The research attempted to understand how masculinities is impacted by a lot of features of everyday life, and yeah, and like how masculinities cannot be understood in isolation. So we have attempted to talk about what are the other factors that come into place. So in that, we've tried to talk about sexuality, we've tried to talk about social media, we've tried to talk about relationships and caste to see how all of this works together. And like with this, we try to attempt to understand like how violence is created and functions in everyday lives of men and boys. Along with this, we have also conducted another research, which was called, which was Men, Masculinities, and Mahamari. So the idea of this research was to understand how organizations responded to COVID-19, especially with context of the programs that work with men and boys. And even in this, we tried to understand what were the various linkages that could be created to masculinities program with livelihood, with health, with education to understand like a holistic response, to understand the holistic approach towards masculinities. And along with this, we are also working towards creating a public engagement platform where we attempt to talk about masculinities in a more holistic way, to talk about how it influences our everyday lives and what men and boys can do to like move away from the cultures of patriarchal masculinities. So that's about the program, and looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. Thank you so much, Siddhant. All right, so I'll go over to a question that we have prepared for the three of you. And it'll be great if all of you can respond to this question from your vantage points. So the first question is, and I guess this is coming right out of something Siddhant just touched upon, which is how can masculinity-based programs take into consideration other intersectionalities, such as class, caste, or race?
I can start if you want.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
So I think there are some sort of broad ways to think about this, and then some specific ways. So the broad thing, I think the most broad thing, and I think the value of Siddhant's work in this is actually just recognizing these intersectionalities, right? A lot of times we don't even recognize them and think about them. And so this goes to more specific ways of thinking that include really making an effort to understand how these different social constructs actually affect hierarchy, right? So understanding what the caste context of your intervention site is, and how that plays out, or you know, how race or ethnicity or religious violence could affect programs in your area. For us, when we think about this in terms of designing an intervention, I think a really important way to address issues like caste and class and religious differences is actually, I mean, with the way we do things, we have an opportunity to mobilize people from the community to be caregivers, right? So to be counselors. And so a very like specific thing that we try to do is actually mobilize people from different caste communities and class communities, or different classes, and also from religious communities to be counselors. And I think this is really important because if you have a lay counselor who comes from your context and understands what you're coming from, or what the social conditions you exist in, they'll be able to tailor their caregiving to you in a more specific way. So yeah, happy to turn it over to the others.
I can go next. So like one thing we have to understand, like when we talk about these intersectionalities, is also that like masculinities is not a single identity. And I think this is also what Aneel was trying to say, that when we talk about masculinities, we cannot say that it's just one thing. Like it's also like across all the power structures and across the privileges and vulnerabilities that exist. And having said that, I have two main points to say. One is that having acknowledged that, one, that is a need to conduct more research on the issue of caste and masculinities, because within the sector, I do not think like a lot of research has been conducted to understand caste and masculinities and their specific relation. And within the own research that we conducted called Martuvali Bate, we did say like caste coming up with relation to masculinities a lot. So like if I have to give two examples, one, we were learning about how like with context to social media, caste groups plays a lot of role in like creating a feeling of unity and bond amongst young men. So there are WhatsApp groups that are divided on the basis of caste, and like for specific caste groups, which is also like at times used to reinforce violence upon certain communities. So one is that, and secondly, we also understood it with context to like the style a person has to show. So style in the sense of how one walks, how one represents themselves, it's also influenced a lot by the caste and other intersectionalities one comes from. So one, we have seen a lot of advantage in doing like in understanding masculinities and caste, and therefore we believe that one, a lot more research needs to happen on this. And secondly, like when we talk about in terms of public engagement, one of the things we have also understood is that we also need to take places that are a lot more neutral in nature, such as college spaces, because one, that also allows a lot of people from various communities to come in and engage with the content. And even with that, like, especially while working with people from Dalit Bahujan communities, we also have to like keep violence in mind, because not only are they like, they are also facing the brunt of dominant masculinity. So understanding that also like would provide a better understanding of the entire programming. Yeah.
Thanks, Siddhant. Aneel, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think one thing that Siddhant really demonstrates well is another way to bring into consideration these different intersectionalities, especially for the type of work that we do, is to, even though we position ourselves as researchers, right? Somewhat. I also consider myself an implementer, but is to adopt the perspective of an activist, right? And to operate in solidarity, right? And to just recognize that there are inequalities that we're trying to address, and we want to understand them. But the very first thing is to sort of identify with the people that you're trying to work with, to empower them, and to be humble before them, right? And understand their experience. And that's all about solidarity, activism. And I really like this phrase, like in terms of creating programs and interventions, like creating a preferential option for those who are either poor or marginalized, right? So we have the way our healthcare system and our society works is that the best things go to the people who are the most privileged. So let's start creating healthcare programs and interventions that are actually better for people who need it more. So just wanted to add that as well.
Thanks, Aneel. Andrew, do you want to respond to the main question?
Yeah. I guess I'm not sure I've got much more to add to it. I think, one of the key things that's been raised is these kind of multiple masculinities, and that there are, even within kind of men, these kind of hierarchies of masculinities. And I think one of the big things that we've seen, especially around COVID and how COVID has become thought about by young men and women we've worked with, is really kind of, it's very clear that they understand it as their kind of exclusion from South African society, which they still see, in terms of both class and race, as excluded from. They really understand it as an attempt to kill them, to stop, to get them off the state. So they, these kind of layers of marginalization, are huge and run deep. And I guess, we might think about ways we're trying to address it slightly. One way we're doing little is through kind of working with, through co-developing. I know it's on the big term, co-development, and it can either mean these very kind of lightweight, light touchy consultations. But, over the last, since COVID, actually, since about April or May 2020, we've been working with to try and understand their lives and understand what an intervention that would support them would look like from their perspective, so from the ground up. So it's not exactly challenging these things, but it's trying to restructure, a bit like Aneel said, to kind of listen, to provide the space they need to say what they need in their lives, rather than us say, your problem is, poverty, let's provide poverty, but how do they conceptualize? So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Andrew. So since you talked about COVID-19, I'll just ask all our panelists, have you observed any changes to the notion of masculinity, for better or for worse, that COVID has brought about? Because everyone was kind of, I remember reading about this early on, the idea of men being domesticated because of the lockdowns in the pandemic. And I thought about what that might mean for the, hyper-masculine identity. So, that's just my thought, but any experiences that you want to share?
Unfortunately, for me, because of COVID, our Kushi Mamta program had to stop because we couldn't have counselors go to different households, and our clinical programs continued as best they could outside when the lockdowns finished. So I haven't been able, for the first time in the last 10 years, I haven't been to India for like 2 years to observe the context. But my sense, talking to the counselors and to our team there, is that not much has actually changed, right? If anything, COVID-19 has created a more dire situation for women who are already isolated in their households. And if you can imagine a situation where a woman is facing domestic violence, and maybe there are some opportunities during the day where they can escape the home and go somewhere else, all of a sudden that's taken away from you as well. So it creates an even more dangerous space. So I don't think, the caveat is that I'm not there, and I always hesitate to speak about things that are going on when I'm not there. But my sense is that things have gotten worse because of COVID-19.
Thanks, Aneel. Anyone else?
Can I jump in? So I fully agree with Aneel. For our young people in informal settlements, all COVID has done is made things a lot worse. And I think, we've even, I know in India, some states have banned alcohol. We had very temporary alcohol bans, which, were quickly worked around. And so while kind of the middle classes might have lost access to alcohol, in informal settlements, very quickly strategies emerged, and poverty, kind of drugs, alcohol uses got worse, mental health has got worse. I guess one of the other studies I've been doing led by one of my colleagues, Pinky Maflangu, has actually been interviewing people over the phone about their experiences of COVID. And I think, with COVID lockdown specifically, and I think one of the big things has been this real class differentiation based on whether you could continue working or not. So where, typically people in middle class situations whose jobs continue to be carried on working from home, obviously kids create stresses, but there were much more stories of men saying, oh, it's a chance to, be around the family, things like that. But for situations where people lost their jobs, all it seemed to do is make things a lot worse, including tensions at home. And so, as described by Aneel, the conflict increased. So I think that's another way in which class has overlaid this experience. Yeah.
Thanks, Andy.
So thanks, Andrew. That's one of the points I also wanted to talk about, because we also conducted a research to understand the impact of COVID-19 on organizations working with men and boys. As Andrew said, one of the things we saw directly was that livelihood was directly related to tensions that were being created at home. So, for example, loss of livelihood meant more tensions at home. That is one of the things we saw. Another thing we saw was we were also thinking of violence with contextual healthcare. So, for example, due to lockdown, there was an immediate need also trigger warning sexual violence. So, also one of the things that we saw was that since everyone was stuck at home, one, men wanted to engage in a lot more sexual activities, and two, because they couldn't step out, a lot of times, they were engaging in sexual activities without the use of contraceptives, which also had worse impact on the communities. And even with this, we have used this research to talk about how there needs to be an intersectional lens while working with men and boys, because these two examples clearly show how when we are talking with men and boys on the issues of masculinities and GBV, there is one, a need to talk about livelihood issues, and two, there's also a need to talk about healthcare issues, because at the end of the day, they both also relate to masculinities issues only. So, yeah.
Siddhant, yeah, I think universally there's been the pandemic has worsened people's access to health and other facilities, but I think with the economic loss that's compounded the stress on families and individuals, and I think men often have to pick up the bulk of that responsibility, for better or for worse. So I'll jump into questions from the audience now. And there are some direct questions which I'll come to eventually. There is one question that I think all of you can answer, which will be helpful for our young researchers who are attending. So somebody asks, what are some best practices for making men comfortable enough to disclose violence perpetration? So they're asking for strategies to engage men meaningfully in research so that they can speak about perpetrating violence.
Let me start, that's okay. I guess, yeah, it's the big question, how do we make it safe? And I guess there are a number of ways of thinking about safety. I guess one of the key things is around kind of ensuring confidentiality. People have to believe that what they say in an interview, in whatever setting it is, whether it's a kind of psychotherapeutic setting, whether it's in a kind of qualitative in-depth interview or a quantitative interview, they've got to believe that it's confidential and what they say there will not get out, which is something that can only be done through kind of skilled field staff, or a skilled person who's built up that rapport and learns how to do it. So it's kind of ensuring that confidentiality, building the rapport. And in reality, people, the bits of interviews that I've done with men have been more open about disclosing violence as opposed to issues around food insecurity, which have a much more kind of emotional resonance. People, men get, obviously suggest something isn't right when they're quite open about it, kind of sharing about violence. But the kind of issues for them often aren't around violence, it's about other issues in their lives where they struggle. But we have to build in that kind of safety, autonomy, privacy aspect to it. I'm sure everyone else has some good ideas.
I can go next. So like from the perspective of our program that directly attempts to implement with men and boys, there are three things I'd like to say. Like one of the things we do is like when we attempt to talk with young men and boys on the issues of masculinities and violence, we like one is like we try to make sure that we are not addressing men only as perpetrators of violence. We try to talk to them more holistically, and we try to understand all their experiences, because what we've seen is like when we try to talk with men and boys only in terms of perpetrators of violence, one, even they are losing out on the incentive to join, because in that context it seems like they will come, we will tell them how violence is bad, and then we will stop. So that's how one, like we try to talk to them, so which is why like we try to talk to them in a more holistic sense, which is to say like also when we are implementing our programs with men and boys, like we try to target them as primary audience, where we try to say that you have to engage in the program because this is going to make like your life more holistic and more pleasure based, and your life experience is better. So that also gives an incentive for them to join. And finally, like in doing all of this, we also like try to not look at masculinities in isolation. That is to say, like when we are talking about their experiences of violence, even when we are talking about something like consent, we try to talk about like how consent and masculinities are related to each other, which is how men are told never to hear the word no, rather than just reducing it to men as perpetrators of violence and having to change that. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you, Siddhant. Aneel?
Yeah, I wouldn't have too much more to add. I think the biggest lesson that came out of our formative research, and that kind of motivated the formative research as well, is that it's important to actually just mobilize men for this, right? So a best practice is, even though we exist and many of us operate in patriarchal societies where the actions of men are actually pretty harmful, there are also actions that men do that are pretty helpful. And, there are like quote unquote good men out there, and it's important to mobilize these good men for this purpose. So I think that would be the only thing that I'll add there. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks for that, Aneel. Before I go to the audience question, I had a question based on what you and Siddhant just said, which is, looking at men, interventions focused on men. But I think what we've seen a lot of, at least in some of the work that we've done with violence against women, is that men often become instruments of the problem because they're perpetrating, let's say, the intimate partner violence. So men being used, being sort of painted as the problem, and then working with men to improve women's health, or to achieve women empowerment. I wonder if you've Aneel, I know you've tried to do that, but I wonder if anyone has has a different perspective on that. Like what happens when men are explicitly targeted or worked with as a way to improve women's experiences? What happens? In theory it sounds okay, but I think the very practical reality of trying to do something like that and maybe making men feel like they are the problem, does anybody have any experience related to that?
I can try to.
You go, Siddhant. So I was going to say, no, you speak. You go first.
Yeah, sorry. So like, I just wanted to say that like I have tried also something like that. I think the major issue we face with something like that is we only tell men not to do violence, which also feels very restrictive, because when you say something like don't do violence, you're also not telling them what other things they can do, why violence is harmful in itself. So like a lot of broader questions this entire conversation fails to ignore, which is why I think like a more holistic perspective answers this well. Yeah, Andrew, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly, you had said that earlier, and just to repeat, I think by thinking of it, as working with men to improve their lives and improve women's lives, it's a joint benefit, because the drivers, it's about the challenges both men and women face together, and other people. Yeah.
Just to echo, I think the most important lesson that I think Andrew shared in his beginning talk was how important male mental health and well-being is to improve female mental health and well-being. And so, it like, to me, it really shouldn't be about blame, right? It's about mobilizing and working for seeing the interaction between men and women, and how well-being on one side affects well-being on the other side. So, if substance abuse is a major risk factor for domestic abuse, then we need to see, where that substance abuse comes from, and the violence and abuse that was experienced during childhood for the men, right? What kind of life they had. And also the pressures around economic responsibility, and there are really important cultural norms in northern India about men being able to run a household and be able to host and be able to raise their children and send them to school. And if they can't fulfill those needs, then how do we improve their economic well-being, and can that have a direct impact on domestic violence? So yeah, it's very important to not approach it in terms of blame, or even like, I hesitate to say like criminality, but of course there is that aspect of it as well. But in sort of solidarity and a holistic well-being framework.
Thanks, Aneel. And I could see Andy nodding, so I'm guessing that he agrees with you. So this is a question that's for Andy, but what I'm going to do is I think it applies to all our speakers, which is about navigating the power dynamics with your own research participants in terms of your own privilege. So when you're working with the sensitive issues of sexuality, gender, masculinity, especially when you're going into marginalized communities or communities where you occupy a relatively more powerful position, how do you manage or balance that out in research? And so how have you seen it impact your processes or your outcomes?
Thanks, and thanks to the person who raised this. It's kind of one of those big questions that, especially as one gets a little older, one starts to grapple with more and more. And I don't think I've got a very good answer. I think I've got 4 things we're doing. I think one is, like, I really try to the best of my ability to understand, and so not to kind of to understand where these young people are coming from, to understand the underlying causes, the drivers, their experiences, their everyday lives. So this isn't about describing this is what they do. It's taking that step back and thinking, why do they do it? What are the issues that they're grappling with, which shapes kind of their lives in certain ways? So sitting back a lot, so kind of setting them as we've been saying in that kind of holistic picture. I guess another thing we've been doing increasingly is really trying to think through this kind of co-development aspect to it. So handing a lot more power over to the NGO we work with and to young people who they work with. The NGO works, a lot of their staff are young and Black, and some of them come from the same kind of challenging circumstances, same context. And so we've tried to give them a lot more power in making decisions around research, at what the intervention looks like. And that's very hard, I want nice transcripts so I can write papers and do stuff, but it's a step. It still is very complicated, and obviously we come along, and I'm the one who horns the grant. So at some level, I still have a lot of power, but it's an attempt to. I guess third one is something around, and I've not started this yet, but trying to think through starting to study upwards, masculinities upwards. Obviously, this criticism is I'm studying masculinities going downwards, down the power hierarchies. And I need to start thinking about how do we start looking upwards, and the way in which kind of white European male masculinities kind of impact and shape the terrain for other people. The one only example I've ever read has been around climate change. So I can be however liberal I like at home, bounce babies, be lovely to my partner, whatever, but then I jump on planes and cause massive climate change, which doesn't affect me because I'm in my aircon office, but really affects the young people we work with on a daily basis. So my kind of forms of masculinity and trying to understand that. So really kind of start seeing masculinities as kind of this big mix of everything, kind of all interlinked. And then the last one is really about building the next generation of researchers. Even though I'm still quite young, I really do see it as, now's the time. I've published enough, I've done enough, and now it's really about getting the next generation who are much closer, who can do the research, who are more embedded, who are much better placed to do the research than I am, and really supporting them to kind of take over already from me. So yeah, it's not great, but...
Thanks, Andy. I think 4 points is impressive enough. Aneel, you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, these are questions that keep social scientists up at night, right? Especially those like me. You can tell from my accent, right? I'm a North American, and I've moved to India, to a village, and so there are going to be power differentials, and a lot of them that I don't really understand and can't necessarily see, no matter how much time I spend there. And it has been a long time. But I think there are some buzzwords now that are pretty important, even though they're trendy. And Andrew mentioned one, which is like co-production. It's trendy, but it's really, really important, right? We want to, anything that we do, we want to check our assumptions as people with power, and make sure that that voices from below are heard and incorporated. And even that framing, right, below about we have to really be critical. The other sort of buzzword is decolonizing global health practice, right? And an important thing that I think frames a lot of the formative research. So there was a question in the chat about more about the formative research that we did. The whole motivation for us to do that was to actually check our assumptions and do formative research that is informed by the actual people that we're trying to help. So we interviewed women who are suffering from domestic violence. We also interviewed men, right? This is how we're getting these ideas about how to mobilize men. And this is really about decolonizing how knowledge is formed and the knowledge that goes into these practices. So the other words, I think they're really important, and they help us think about things. And I think from a really, really practical point of view, from my research lens, is really, like, as much as I can, even though I am an anthropologist and ethnography is important, is really like removing myself from the scene as much as I can. And so a lot of my ethnographic knowledge comes from actually like lay counselors, female lay counselors who are from the communities who interact with women, because they'll get things that I just could never get and understand. And then really talking to these counselors about their experiences and having them tell me what they saw and not interpreting it for them. So I hope that's helpful and clear.
Thanks, Aneel. Siddhant?
Just echoing one of the points that has been said, one of the practices that we use for the process is that every time like a document is created or a research is completed, rather than like publishing it finally, like one round for us is always like, taking the research, taking it back to the people, giving them, a week or so of time to read the research, give us their feedback, asking them if like we've written, if they agree with what we've written, and only like once they have like given us their approval, only then the research is published. So like that is one of the things we have been doing. But, yeah.
Thanks, Siddhant, and thank you all for answering that very difficult question and reflective question. So thank you for being for your introspection. This is a question that again I think is for all speakers. What I think the person is trying to ask is what happens what happens to masculinity when the men that you're working with are themselves marginalized or not at the very top of the sort of social hierarchy. So for in India, that would be queer men, or DBA men, and I guess everywhere else also queer men, but Andrew, for you, white men, but in the context that you're working with, non-white men, how do they navigate masculinity while being sort of minorities in their context?
At the risk of maybe addressing this question in too philosophical a way, I think it's important to sort of take masculinity, I guess, separated from the individual body, and recognize that patriarchy and toxic masculinity exists at the structural level as well. So, people like, if you're inclined to read this kind of stuff, but people like Veena Das write about like India as a very masculine state, right? From partition on, and how these policies and programs actually affect individual lives. And I think this is a really important, sorry if this is too abstract, but this is a really important mindset, because when we think about norms and masculinities and patriarchy as it exists, like say within a household, it can potentially lead to a slippery slope where we're blaming people for their own problems, right? We can say, oh, this group does this because that's what they culturally do. And so we really need to keep in mind these structural factors and recognize that, a lot of times violence at a certain level exists because of violence at another level, a more structural or more invisible kind of violence. A really good example of this is, the rhetoric around in the United States, Black on Black violence, right? They say, well, Black people kill Black people. Well, that's, true statistically. White people also kill white people more than, other groups, racial groups. But these are because of social and structural factors that lead to these inequalities of experience. So when we design things, we have to keep all those in mind, and we have to be pretty careful to not end up blaming the victim, right? We don't also want to just call perpetrators of violence victims because they're perpetrating violence, but it's important to recognize all these sort of micro and macro level factors that influence patriarchy.
Adding to that, I think like that's also one of the things we try to do in our program, that when we talk about intersectionalities, like sexuality as an identity is always included in it. So for example, if we are, whatever session we are doing, like usually we talk about, like cis, gendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, upper class, upper caste men. So like when we are defining someone as this person, what we also try to do is we try to talk about like who are coming up with this criteria of this being a man and these labels being a real man. and who does it benefit, and how real are these standards? So when we talk about something like how real are these standards, we also like make the participants realize that these standards cannot be met by everyone, and they are designed in such a way that not everyone can reach them. So when the participants reach this point of realization, we try to navigate the conversation forward by saying that at the end of the day, patriarchal masculinities is very limiting, but like masculinities in broad is like can also be something a good thing. So when we have a conversation like this, we try to force the participants to think outside the idea of patriarchal masculinities towards masculinities that they might be comfortable with and something that allows them to express themselves. And as that happens, I think like these intersectionalities are covered.
Yeah, I think the point about getting people to think about what masculinities are available, you know, in their context is really important in terms of how that limits. Often I think in the context I work in, there are relatively few forms of masculinity positions available to build on. And I think, as Siddhant just said, you know, trying to get people to imagine alternative ways of being is really hard. Because I think, you know, but an important way of starting to envisage something different, which is kind of what we're all trying to do. And I think people struggle, you know, we tried to do this in one way by not envisage alternatives, but instead of getting people to speak about their lives, it was on some early work around co-production and stuff. We tried to get people to draw up stories, kind of a river they envisaged, you know, someone a bit like them, but not like them. And I think they struggle to envisage things radically different, and basically people's lives, you know, these made-up characters reflected their own lives. And I don't know, and we're still trying to think, is it, you know, that they couldn't envisage worlds? But interestingly, one thing that did pop up, a number of women described having lesbian relationships or sex with other women, maybe not lesbians, a bit too strong a word for how they might have thought about it, but by giving that chance, you know, we might have started to unearth something that they otherwise wouldn't have talked about. Yeah.
Great, thank you, everyone. There's one question, I think, which is about if any of you know any evidence or have collected any evidence around what motivates men to perpetrate violence. And I'll be happy if you want to pop in any links into the chat, we can pass those on, unless any of you want to answer that question live about what motivates men to perpetrate violence. But otherwise, I'm happy to just do this on chat. Anybody?
Yeah, I guess, you know, I've been involved in a number of kind of quantitative studies and qualitative studies, and about kind of men's perpetration. And I guess we haven't done so much questions about, well, qualitatively maybe we have, but quantitatively, you know, we'll measure things like depression, poverty, men's controlling behaviors, experiences of violence growing up, things like that, which all kind of, you know, if you want to use complex statistics, you know, all kind of interact together in ways, and you can see how kind of these issues are rooted in kind of challenges young people, men had growing up. I guess when you get into kind of qualitative work, you often lose that kind of abstraction, and you end up focusing more on kind of immediate kind of trigger factors maybe one wants to talk about. So we've done work which, you know, a lot of men, especially in these contexts, feel the need to feel a lot of shame. You know, and this isn't kind of my argument, I forget who wrote about it. James Gilligan in the US, after working with men in incarceration, wrote a lot about this. And you know, men feeling ashamed and feeling they needed to maintain their kind of respectability. And I think qualitatively, one of the best bits of work, which is again not what I've done, is Philip Bourgeois Men in Search of Respect, working in the US, but really trying to unpick those questions of respectability and how one maintains some form of control and identity. So it's a big mess. So I'll send links afterwards. Yeah.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to add anything? Aneel or Siddhant?
The way we have been trying to understand masculinities and its relation to violence for our implementation is like, first of all, we try to understand masculinities as something that is like very continuous and very constant process. So like it has to be proven at every point, and at the same time, like it's considered to be very fragile. So like anything can drop it. So like and break the entire idea of masculinity. So like at no one point can a person say that, oh, I'm masculine enough. Because there's also, you know, a need to keep on showing that I have to be more masculine, I have to be more dominating. So when that idea comes into like the picture, what happens is like masculinity, like violence becomes like a very convenient way of, controlling the other person and ensuring that one's own status is maintained. So, for example, in this context, like emotional violence, verbal violence, and even manipulation for that matter can be used so easily because when the idea is to only maintain control, like violence allows that to do it a lot more easily. And like that eventually ends up taking any place of communication and negotiation.
I think that's a really, really good point, Siddhant. It's almost an unachievable ideal in that sense, right? You have to keep striving for a more version of that, and you will actually never achieve it. And it's also at the same time very easy to break. It's something very easily threatened. I think that's a really, really great way that you've put that. Anil, do you want to add anything? Or should I go to the next question?
I guess the only thing I would say is like thinking about motivation. I mean, you could go in two ways. You could go sort of like internal, psychoanalytic way, you know, what kind of motivates violence. Then you can go more structural. And I think Andrew talked about triggers, right? So, and where you go probably depends on what you want to do with the information. So if you're in a place where violence is really endemic and happens a lot and you want to reduce the perpetration of violence, probably just explore the risk factors and the triggers, right? And try to find ways to deal with that. And if you're interested in getting to the root cause of violence in society, maybe that's a different approach that is just as important, because then we can get to more of the structural things. But so yeah, it's a big question. Who knows, you know, what motivates anybody to do anything? But yeah, but an interesting one nonetheless.
Thanks, Aneel. Spoken like a true researcher. Since I'm going to sort of steal Andy's language here a little bit, you spoke about working with your participants and asking them to envisage a better future. So I'm going to ask you all to do the same. So what does a future where hegemonic or patriarchal masculine norms, I don't know if they don't exist, but what is a future where they are transformed in a way that they are better and they're not perhaps as harmful as they are now? So what needs to change for a future like that?
Happy to maybe kick it off, and then the others can present their visions. You know, I'm always, even though the last answer was spoken like a true researcher, I always like to think about practical things and implementation and programs, and like how the world might look different in a really practical way. And for our context in Rajasthan, and I think a lot of India and South Asia, and maybe other places too. I see the root cause of a lot of health outcomes inequality and mental health inequality to be just a lack of agency, right? And isolation, and all of that is related to marriage and kinship and those kinds of things in our area. So what I would like to see is a world in which a woman can choose and make decisions for herself. And I think that relates directly to having the opportunity to work, to go to school, and to just sort of empower herself with knowledge and face the world in that way. Ideally, we'd like to see gender inequalities disappear. I don't think, it's hard to see how we can do that as program people, right? But if we can create programs that help somebody within a patriarchy and then navigate that patriarchy by having financial independence or by having access to support networks and these kinds of things, I think that's a really important practical start. And it'd be great if everybody could go to school, and everybody could have the opportunity to work, and everybody could have the opportunity to take themselves to a clinic if they need to, or have the opportunity to delay marriage and pregnancy. So just that kind of agency, I think, is really, really important.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I can go. So the way we go ahead with this and how masculinities might look like in future is that firstly the sessions that we conduct, the idea of those sessions is not to asking men to end gender-based violence or something as big as that. The primary idea of our sessions is to make men more confused and for them to understand how masculinities is taught to them through various sources. So one of them is definitely the cinema. The other one is through the role models that we follow. So once that kind of reflection is created, what we do is we talk about how there's no one form of masculinity because how fluid it is. It keeps on changing with time. It keeps on changing with space. It keeps on changing according to context. And that is the point where we try to reach with our sessions. And once that point is reached, we try to open up the discussion towards saying that, okay, now that, masculinities can literally be constructed as and how the participants want, we try to take the conversation forward by asking them how they would like it to look like. What are the do's and don'ts that they would like to see? What are the do's and don'ts they won't like to see? How it would be different from patriarchal masculinities. And I think by the time we reach that point, some kind of reflection has started to happen on what needs to be accepted and what not.
Thanks, Siddhant.
I think both those answers are spot on, kind of both the addressing kind of people's fundamental and basic needs would have a massive impact, I think, on many things, kind of including violence against women, and getting people to imagine and think about different ways of being is also a crucial kind of thing to open up kind of, people talk about constrictive boxes and stuff like that, the constrictions of masculinity. So yeah, those are two really key things. I guess there's also this bigger philosophical question about, are all masculinities necessarily bad? And that's, something, you might talk about over a late night discussion. And whether we need to try and get rid of masculinity and femininity and, kind of these binary type ideas and establish something else. But I guess, yeah, we need to think about what's achievable in the here and now while still kind of dreaming about future worlds and stuff like
that. I'll just say, I like the idea of getting men confused, right? By challenging assumptions and things like that, and unsettling notions. And then, I'll just also mention, maybe we often have male only panels, right? In research, we talk about that, and yeah, I mean, but in this case, we have like a male panel that's talking about hierarchies and masculinity. So I think that's really important. So yeah, kudos to the team for bringing this together.
Thanks, Aneel. Siddhant, do you want to add something? So both you and Aneel are nodding when Andy was speaking.
So yeah, like what Andy was saying, like that's one thing that we still have a discussion about internally within our team, like how the future of masculinity should look like, because there are some people in our team who believe that like masculinities can be positive, and like with time, we need to work towards creating non-harmful versions of masculinities. And I, on the other hand, I'm non-binary, so like the entire idea of gender binary does not make sense to me, which is like I always come with the opinion that no, we just have to get done with masculinity and femininity. So I think, yeah, that's a topic for late night discussion.
Great. Thank you all so much. All right, so we have 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do then is I think we've covered most of the questions. There is one question about stigma associated with help seeking amongst the trans community in India. I don't know if Aneel or Siddhant, you have any experience with these communities. If you do, then you can take maybe a minute to answer that question.
I actually don't work too directly with the trans community in a rural setting. I think if I understand it right, a lot of times the trans community will find home bases in certain urban settings, and we're very rural. So where we generally see them is like very infrequently at like weddings and things like that. So yeah, I'd defer to Siddhant on this.
I do not think I have enough knowledge to answer this question, but we are also currently doing research to understand trans masculine people and what needs they have when it comes to safer sex.
Great, thank you, Siddhant. So what we'll do, I think I'll invite each of you to offer any closing comments. So maybe if you want to summarize where you see your research going in the next couple of years, and you want to touch upon what your plans are with working with masculinity in your work, that would be very helpful for our listeners.
So the work that we are doing, like for the next few years, like this is the crux of the work that we have started to do, and we are like currently working on creating a website. And the idea of this entire website is to talk about masculinities from a more holistic lens, from a lens where masculinities is viewed as something that happens in everyday life of the participants, and not something that is like only restricted to, say, for example, gender-based violence or one intersectionality. That's majority of the work that we are doing right now. And with this, like, we also plan on expanding, because after this, we plan on including a lot more identities and to talk a lot more about other lived experiences of men and boys. Right now, we are starting with 4 issues. One is like caste and masculinities. Other is consent. Then also on lines of homosexuality. And finally, on how men and boys are enabled through the current society to, like also be toxic and violent. So that's how our work looks like for the coming year.
Wonderful. I like how you said we're just doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things, and we'll do other bigger things later. I think this is a massive mandate, so good luck with that.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so kind of the next bits for me and the team and group I work with, I guess some of it is building this production, co-development out. We've got another couple of years kind of working through that and seeing where it goes and we've also been working with some young women do some of that. That's it. I guess one of the things we're also looking at doing is really focusing in on kind of young people's relationships and looking at the intimate relationship and kind of focusing quite closely in on the triggers and the immediate causes of violence. So trying to not lose the broad structural factors, look at those dynamics, because I think what we've learned from the co-production work is people, when they start thinking about what they want, it's around communication skills, ways of dealing with conflict and stress and the immediacy. So actually building that into our kind of these bigger questions, interventions, while addressing some aspects which are structural. And then the last thing we've just got some money to do is look at the impact of excessive heat and the role and how it impacts on violence in general. And a big thread of that will be on men and masculinities, and try and understand how does climate change, both in the broad sense, but also in the immediate, heat in households, what are the pathways, does it increase poor mental health, which studies suggest it does, and violence, but how? And then obviously, the big question, can we do anything to address it at the individual rather than kind of broad level? So trying to expand out our understandings a little as well.
So for us, the next work is to number one, restart our perinatal mental health program, which got delayed by COVID, and so we're keen to do that this year, and hopefully the pandemic will allow us to do that. And the next work, which I hope Devika will be involved in too, is to incorporate the lessons from our formative research into creating a male-focused component to improve perinatal depression. So our focus is, because we're a maternal and child health center, our focus is always going to be improving the well-being of young mothers. That's kind of our focus and our target. And we want to mobilize men, both as the target of some interventions, but also as agents of change, right? Whether they're counselors themselves or older men from the community who can mentor younger men through changes and be that sort of good masculinity role model. We want to incorporate those things into this perinatal depression program. So there's a lot of figuring out to do. We've got this formative research, and we want to take those lessons and make something practical and real out of it. And that's, I think, the work for the next couple of years, at least.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much. I think all of the work that you've described, both what you've done, but also what you want to do, sounds really, really fascinating. And I just really want to thank you all, because this has been a wonderful panel on a topic that I think many of us in the violence space tend to see as a barrier or the real sort of problem. But I think this panel, we've taken a slightly empathetic and perhaps better informed position on the topic of masculinity. And I really want to thank you all for bringing your experience and perspectives to our listeners. I hope that you guys will find time to attend the other sessions. Thank you all so very much for sharing your time with us. I'll make a few announcements for our attendees. You can feel free to drop off if you like. That's just for the speakers. I would like to talk to the attendees for a few more minutes. But we have another session starting in about half an hour, which is a global session on bridging the gap between research and practice and responding to domestic violence. We have a professor from SOAS in London who will be delivering that lecture. So please do join the link for the global session. Tomorrow we have another full day packed for you guys, which is starting at 9:30 a.m., where we're hearing from 3 organizations that are doing some excellent work in the violence against women and mental health space in India. We've got a team from NIMHANS, Nirantar and Sambali, who will be talking to you about their work And for all attendees who are interested in networking or finding opportunities to work or collaborate with local organizations, I think this will be a really good session. And then we've got two panels, one on intimate partner violence in India and Bangladesh, and another on dating violence later in the day. So thank you all for attending and for asking questions and interacting with our speakers, and we'll see you in the global session. We've also added a panel for feedback on the Jamboard. So if you can do that, if you can take some time to provide feedback, that'll be really good, and that'll help us learn and do better. Thank you. See you guys at 4:30.